the PRAH. Miam nice to Niger. 45 Maps Africa West Africa Abyssinia North Africa Egypt to face page 82b, frontispiece PAGHOS Sensa. Introduction Ashanti influence on Jamaica customs Robert T. Hill of the United States Geological Survey, writing towards the close of the last century, was emphatic in his statement, "The Jamaican Negroes are sui generis, nothing like them, even of their own race, can elsewhere be found, not even elsewhere in the West Indies. They are omnipresent. The towns, the country highways, and the woods ring with their laughter and merry songs, they fill the churches and throng the highways, especially on market days, when the country roads are black with them, and they are witty and full of queer stories and folklore. Plus he is." Speaking of the native blacks, the real peasantry of the island. During a 5 years residence in Jamaica, when much of the time was spent in the bush in close contact with the simple unaffected children of the soil, the present writer, in his turn, was deeply impressed by a striking difference between the Jamaican black and all the other Negro types that he had ever encountered. Jamaica Negroes. W. J. Gardner, in his History of Jamaica, states, "Great numbers of Negro slaves were imported from Africa, representing tribes as diverse in character as different European nations. Among these the fierce Coromantines occupied a very prominent place, but though their dangerous character was so well known, their superior strength was so highly valued as to lead to the rejection of all measures proposed to check their importation." Later on, the same author, while describing the various classes of slaves, tells us, "The Negroes from the Gold Coast were known generally as Coromantines. The Ashantis and the Fans described African slaves. Coromantines. 1 Robert T. Hill, Cuba and Puerto Rico with the other islands of the West Indies, New York, 1808, p. 227. 2 W. J. Gardner, History of Jamaica, London, 1909, p. 132. Baidukela were included in this term. They were strong and active, and on this account valued by the planters. The Spanish and the French colonists shunned them on account of their ferocious tendencies, but attempts to prohibit their importation into Jamaica failed, though they were the instigators and leaders of every rebellion. Degree Brian Edwards, the historian, for many years a resident of Jamaica and a member of the council *, furnishes us with the most authentic description of these Coromantan slaves, and as an appreciation of their characteristic traits will help to clarify what follows. A somewhat lengthy quotation from his graphic account may be pardoned. Speaking from his personal observations, he says, "The circumstances which distinguish the Coromantan, or Gold Coast, Negroes, from all others, are firmness both of body and mind, a ferociousness of disposition, but withal, activity, courage, and a stubbornness, or what an ancient Roman would have deemed an elevation, of soul, which prompts them to enterprises of difficulty and danger, and enables them to meet death, in its most horrible shape, with fortitude and indifference. They sometimes take to labor with great promptitude and alacrity, and have constitutions well adapted for it, for many of them have undoubtedly been slaves in Africa. I have interrogated great numbers on this subject, and although some of them asserted they were born free, who, as it afterwards proved by the testimony of their own relations, were actually sold as slaves by their masters, others frankly confessed to me that they had no claim to freedom in their own country, and were sold either to pay the debts, or to expiate the crimes of their owners. On the other hand, the Gold Coast being inhabited by various different tribes which are engaged in perpetual warfare and hostility with each other, there cannot be a doubt that many of the captives taken in battle, and sold in the European settlements, were of free condition in their native country, and perhaps the owners of slaves themselves. It is not wonderful that such men should endeavor, even by means the most desperate, to regain the freedom of which they had been deprived, nor do I conceive that any further circumstances are necessary to 3 Tatum, p. 175 Frank Kundal, Historic Jamaica, London, 1915, p. 308 ff. Brian Edwards account. Prompt them to action, than that of being sold into captivity in a distant country. I mean only to state facts as I find them. Such I well know was the origin of the Negro Rebellion slave, which happened in Jamaica in 1760. It arose at the Rebellion Scram P7 of 1760. Instigation of a Coromandan Negro of the name of Tacky, who had been a chief in Guinea, and it broke out on the frontier plantation in St. Mary's Parish, belonging to the late Ballard Beckford, and the adjoining estate of Trinity, the property of my deceased relation and benefactor Zachary Bailey. On these plantations were upwards of 100 Gold Coast Negroes newly imported, and I do not believe that an individual amongst them had received the least shadow of ill treat meant from the time of their arrival there. Concerning those on Trinity Estate, I can pronounce of my own knowledge that they were under the government of an overseer of singular tenderness and humanity. His name was Abraham Fletcher, and let it be remembered, in justice even to the rebels, and as a lesson to other overseers, that his life was spared from respect to his virtues. The insurgents had heard of his character from the other Negroes, and suffered him to pass through them unmolested. This fact appeared in evidence. Having collected themselves into a body about 1 o'clock in the morning, they proceeded to the fort at Port Maria, killed the sentinel, and provided themselves with as great a quantity of arms and ammunition as they could conveniently dispose of. Being by this time joined by a number of their countrymen from the neighboring plantations, they marched up the high road that led to the interior parts of the country, carrying death and desolation as they went. At Ballard's Valley they surrounded the overseer's house about 4 in the morning, in which 8 or 10 white people were in bed, every one of whom they butchered in the most savage manner, and literally drank their blood mixed with rum. At Esher, and other estates, they exhibited the same tragedy, and then set fire to the buildings and canes. In one morning they murdered between 30 and 40 whites, not sparing even infants at the breast, before their progress was stopped. Tacky, the chief, was killed in the woods, by one of the parties that went in pursuit of them, but some others of the ringleaders being taken, and a general inclination to revolt appearing among all the Coromandan Negroes in the island, it was thought necessary to make a few terrible examples of some of the most guilty. Of 3 who were clearly proved to have been gruesome concerned in the murders committed at Ballard's reprisals Valley, 1 was condemned to be burned, and the other 2 to be hung up alive in irons, and left to perish in that dreadful situation. The wretch that was burned was made to sit on the ground, and his body being chained to an iron stake, the fire was applied to his feet. He uttered no groan, and saw his legs reduced to ashes with the utmost firmness and composure, after which one of his arms by some means getting loose, he snatched a brand from the fire that was consuming him, and flung it in the face of the executioner. The 2 that were hung up alive were indulged, at their own request, with a hearty meal immediately before they were suspended on the gibbet, which was erected in the parade of the town of Kingston. From that time, until they expired, they never uttered the least complaint, except only of cold in the night, but diverted themselves all day long in discourse with their countrymen, who were permitted, very improperly, to surround the gibbet. On the 7th day a notion prevailed among the spectators, that one of them wished to communicate an important secret to his master, my near relation, who being in St. Mary's Parish, the commanding officer sent for me. I endeavored, by means of an interpreter, to let him know that I was present, but I could not understand what he said in return. I remember that both he and his fellow sufferer laughed immoderately at something that occurred I know not what. The next morning one of them silently expired, as did the other on the morning of the 9th day. We may here be allowed to digress long enough York, degree. Parallel, to remark that while one cannot help being shocked at this inhuman treatment, it does not behoove us to reproach the Jamaica planters. For, it is reported that after a Negro insurrection in New York in 1741, no less than 13 unfortunate blacks were given to the flames, 18 were imprisoned and 88 deported. Registered 5 Brian Edwards, History Civil and Commercial of the British West Indies, London, 1793, Volume 2, p. 63 ff. Degree Sir William S. Nelson, La Race Noire dans la démocratie américaine, Paris, 1922, p. 3. But let us now return to the narrative of Brianina Edwards. He continues, the courage or unto death, CERN, which the people of this country manifest at the approach of death, arises, doubtless, in a great measure, from their national manners, wars, and superstitions, which are all in the highest degree savage and sanguinary. A power over the lives of his slaves is possessed, and exercised too, on very frivolous occasions, without compunction and scruple, by every master of slaves on the Gold Coast. Fathers have the like power over their children. In their wars they are bloody and cruel beyond any nation that ever existed, for all such of their captives as they reserve not for slaves, they murder with circumstances of outrageous barbarity, cutting them across the face, and tearing away the underjaw, which they preserve as a trophy, leaving the miserable victims to perish in that condition. I have collected this account from themselves. They tell me likewise, that whenever a considerable man expires, several of his wives, and a great number of his slaves, are sacrificed at his funeral. This is done, say they, that he may be properly attended in the next world. This circumstance has been confirmed to me by every Gold Coast Negro that I have interrogated on the subject, and I have inquired of many. In a country where executions are so frequent, and human blood is spilled with so little remorse, death must necessarily have lost many of its terrors, and the natives in general, conscious they have no security even for the day that is passing over them, seem prepared for, and resigned to, the fate that probably awaits them. This contempt of death, or indifference about life, they bring with them to the West Indies, but if fortunately they fall into good hands at first, and become well settled, they acquire by degrees other sentiments and notions. Nature resumes her lawful influence over them. With the consciousness of security, the love of existence also, amidst all the evils that attend it in a state of slavery, gains admission into their bosoms. They feel it, and, such is the force of habitual barbarity, seem ashamed of their own weakness. A gentleman of Jamaica visiting a valuable Coromandan Negro that was sick, and perceiving that he was thoughtful and dejected, endeavored by soothing and encouraging language, to raise his drooping spear. "It's Massa," said the Negro, in a tone of self-reproach and conscious degeneracy, "since me come to white man's country me love, life too much." Even the children brought from the Gold Coast manifest an evident superiority both in hardiness of frame, and vigor of mind, over all the young people of the same age that are imported from other parts of Africa. The like firmness and intrepidity which are distinguished in adults of this nation, are visible in their boys at an age which might be thought too tender to receive any lasting impression, either from precept or example. I have been myself an eyewitness to the truth of this remark. In the circumstances I am about to relate, a gentleman of my acquaintance, who had purchased at the same time 10 Coromandan boys, and the like number of Ebos, the eldest of the whole apparently not more than 13 years of age, caused them all to be collected and brought before him in my presence, to be marked on the breast. This operation is performed by heating a small silver brand, composed of 1 or 2 letters, in the flame of spirits of wine, and applying it to the skin, which is previously anointed with sweet oil. The application is instantaneous, and the pain momentary. Nevertheless, it may be easily supposed that the apparatus must have a frightful appearance to a child. Accordingly, when the timidity of first boy, who happened to be one of the Ebos, and the stoutest of the whole, was led forward to receive the mark, he screamed dreadfully, while his companions of the same nation manifested strong emotions of sympathetic terror. The gentleman stopped his hand, but the Coromandan boys, laughing aloud, and, immediravado of 5 Coromantines, 2 telly coming forward of their own accord, of caneford their bosoms undauntedly to the brand, and, receiving its impression without flinching in the least, snapped their fingers in exultation over the poor Igbos. One cannot surely but lament, that a people thus naturally emulous and intrepid, should be sunk into so deplorable a state of barbarity and superstition, and that their spirits should ever be broken down by the yoke of slavery. Whatever may be load concerning their ferociousness and implacability in their present notions of right and wrong, I am persuaded that they pos branding of slaves says qualities which are capable of, and well deserve cultivation and improvement. 7. Who, then, were these Coromantines, who as a matter of fact, maintained a commanding influence in Jamaica over all the other types of slaves, even imposing on them their own peculiar superstitions and religious practices, and who have left their impress on the general population of the island to such an extent that they may undoubtedly be declared the dominant influence in evolving our Jamaica peasant of the present day. The term Coromantan, or as we frequently find it Coromantan spelled with AC, was not the name of any particular race or tribe. Strictly speaking, it was applied in general to those slaves who were brought from the Gold Coast in West Africa and who measured up to a certain standard or quality. Its derivation can only be conjectured with more or less plausibility. Captain Rattray, while describing the great oath of the Ashanti whereby they appeal for justice directly to the paramount chief, possibly throws some light on the subject. This solemn oath was taken merely by uttering the words Meme Nata Coromant, that is, literally, Coromant Saturday, and the real import of the words was this: if the king or paramount chief did not render justice to the one who was making the appeal, might the same evil befall the people as had happened at Coromant on a Saturday. Thus the oath was in reality a conditional curse. The author then goes on to state, that it was at a place called Coromant that Osai Panian of Kumasi was defeated and slain, and adds, this calamity was considered so terrible that even the name came to be proscribed and became known simply as Entum Kez, the Great Oath. Origin of Coromantines. Meme Nata Coromant, Lieutenant Colonel Ellis, formerly of the lately disbanded Ashanti West India Regiment, who spent many years upon defeat at Arbts, Roromant. The Gold Coast, thus refers to this incident which took place in a war between the Ashanti and the Akims, as Osai Tudo was on his way to join this army with the 7 Brian Edwards, 1. See Volume 2, p. 64 ff8r. Sutherland Rattray, was Poses Oxford, 1916, number 496, p. 130. Small escort, he and his followers were suddenly attacked by a strong body of the enemy, which, lying in ambush, fell upon them as they were crossing the Pra. The king was wounded in the side at the first fire, but he threw himself out of his hammock, and was rallying his men, when a second volley was discharged, and he fell dead upon his face in the river. Registered the brother of Osai Tudo shortly after crushed the Akims and completely obliterated the town of Coromant, or as Ellis calls it Acromanti, where the party of Akims who had slain Osai Tudo was halted on the night previous to their attack, every living creature found in it being put to death, and every house razed to the ground, degree. As the main supply of slaves, especially at the start, was drawn from the prisoners taken in the endless tribal wars, it is just barely possible that the few captives taken at Coromant may well have been the first of a type that was henceforth to be classified as Coromantines. Then, again, the great oath or curse might itself indicate a like origin of this particular class of slaves, as we shall see shortly. For aside from the prisoners of war, it was no uncommon thing for the native tribes to sell into bondage debtors and criminals generally. Prisoners of war. E.S. Mungo Park, the intrepid adventurer of the Clochefort Debing days of the 18th century, who penetrated alone into the very heart of West Africa, and who lost his life there on the occasion of his second expedition of discovery, states from his own observations, of all the offenses, if insolvency may be so called, to which the laws of Africa have affixed the punishment of slavery, this is the most common. 71 At times too, the petty chieftains helped along their revenues by assessing different villages a certain number of victims who were to be exchanged at the coast for rum and powder. What more natural then, than that the victim of his chieftain's greed should utter the great oath or curse against him, and with meme nata coromant on his lips that he should be started, E.E.B. Ellis, A History of the Gold Coast of West Africa, London, 1893, 10 idem, p. 88. Rest Park, Travels in the Interior Districts of Africa, London, 1810. Into Bondage, His Curse Mistaken by the Slavers for a Homesick Wail for His People and His Country. This, however, is of course mere conjecture. In any case, sufficient for our present purpose is Coromantines, the explanation of Ellis, when he writes, the generically Gold Gold Coast Oost Negroes are termed Coromantes or slaves. Coromantines, in the jargon of the slave traders, this name being a corruption of Coromantine, whence the English had first exported slaves. They were distinguished from all other slaves by their courage, firmness, and impatience of control, characteristics which caused numerous mutinies on board the slavers, and several rebellions in the West Indies. In fact, every rebellion of slaves in Jamaica originated with, and was generally confined to, the Coromantes, and their independence of character became so generally recognized that at one time the legislature of Jamaica proposed that a bill should be brought ir. for laying an additional duty upon the Fantin, Akan, and Ashanti Negroes, and all others, commonly called Coromantes, that should be imported. The superior physique of the Gold Coast Negroes, however, rendered them very valuable as laborers, and this bill met with so much opposition that it was withdrawn, and, notwithstanding their dangerous character, large numbers continued to be introduced to the island. While this derivation of the term would include both Fantis and Akims with the Ashanti, the real Coromantan of type was preeminently an Ashanti, as Sir Harry Johnston clearly recognizes *. Moreover, in connection with the fearless Indio-Opendence and uncompromising spirit of the Gold Maroons Coast Negro, whether we call him Ashanti or Coromantan, it is well to remember that the Maroons of the Jamaica Mountains who wrote their own chapter of daring in the history of the island were for the most part recruited, at least as regards their leaders, from the same group. * 12 Ellis, History of the Gold Coast, p. 94. 8a18 Harry H. Johnston, A History of the Colonization of Africa by Alien Races, Cambridge, 1913, p. 124-14 Note Commander Bedford Pym, R.N. on February 1, 1866, read a paper before the Anthropological Society of London, on the Negro and Jamaica, in connection with the then recent rebellion in the island. In the course of the discussion which followed, a Mr. Harris, speaking from poor Sir William Butler, who arrived on the Gold Coast Sante as to take part in the Ashanti campaign in October, 1873, tells us in his autobiography, this coast has been for 200 and more years the greatest slave preserve in the world. All those castles dotted along the surf-beaten shore at 10 or 12 miles intervals were the prisons where, in the days of the slave trade, millions of wretched Negroes had been immured, waiting the arrival of slave ships from Bristol or Liverpool to load the human cargo for West Indian or American ports. It would not be too much to say that from each of these prison castles to some West Indian port, a cable of slave skeletons must be lying at the bottom of the ocean. In that terrible trade the protected tribes of the coast were the prime brokers. They bought from the black interior kingdoms of Dahomey and Ashanti, and they sold to the white merchant traders of Europe. Slaves, rum, and gunpowder were the chief items in the bills of lading. The gunpowder went to the interior, the rum was drunk on the coast, the slaves, or those who survived among them, went to America. If 2 in 10 lived through the horrors of the Middle Passage, the trade paid 1 degree. This would indicate, first of all, that the Coromantan was not a native of the coast, but was brought from the interior, and secondly, directly indicates the Ashanti as the source of supply. This theory, that the Coromantines, at least as confirmation of Ae, Te regards their leading spirits, were in reality Ashanti, is strongly supported by the folklore and present-day customs of the Jamaica Bush. Even Obia, as it is practiced in the interior of the island, with its cognate branches of Dupiism and Myalism, is directly traceable to the superstitions and practices of the Ashanti in West Africa. So null observation, said in reference to the Maroons of Sierra Leone who had been transported from Jamaica by way of Halifax, the Maroons are principally descendants of the Gold Coast tribes, and still retain amongst them the same religious superstitions, customs, and common names, as, for instance, the naming of their children after the days of the week upon which they were born, such as Quimin, Monday, the son of Quaco, Thursday, each day being denoted by the masculine and feminine gender. They boast of being directly descended, or having been concerned in the Jamaica Rebellion at the end of the 18th century, as partisans of King Cudjoe, a leader. Cfr. Bedford Pym, The Negro and Jamaica, London, 1866, p. 15w, F. Butler, An Autobiography, New York, 1913, p. 149. Nubel Niles Puckett, It is True, shows that much of the Negro folklore of our southern states is due to a European origin. From master to slave, we are told, the stories passed, only to be preserved by the latter long after they had been forgotten by the whites. Registered it is further stated concerning the folk beliefs of the American Negro, purely local African lore would be apt to die out since its devotees in America were too few in number and too scattered to provide the constant repetition necessary for remembrance. Only African beliefs of an universal nature would be likely to survive unless, perchance, many slaves from the same African locality were grouped on a single plantation. This last condition was truly verified in Jamaica. The trouble-making Coromantines, with the Ashanti as their leading spirits, while excluded from most other slave marts, were in great demand in Jamaica. Thus, to give but a single example, Messrs. Copples, one of the leading slave dealers in Kingston, Jamaica, reported having imported and sold 10,380 slaves from November, 1782, to January, 1788, and that of this number no less than 5,724 were from the Gold Coast, that is, Coromantines. 18 Through the folklore of a people we may at times trace its origin as well as its contacts with other peoples. The Jamaica Anansi tales, as has been shown elsewhere, registered are clearly of Ashanti origin. They resemble in many ways the Brer Rabbit stories of Uncle Remus, that are in one form or another common to all the tribes of Africa. However, as the name implies, in the Jamaica folklore it is the spider and not the rabbit or hare that forms the central figure, and here we have a strong indication of the source of the stories, as the Ashanti word for spider is anance. Nay more, while the term is used in the folklore of the Gold Coast today under a slightly different form, Anansi, degree, we find that there the spider's son is called Kwikutsin, while among the Ashanti themselves the name is Antakuma. Is it a mere coincidence that the same individual is styled Takuma in the Jamaica Bush? 16 Nubel Niles Puckett, Folk Beliefs of the Southern Negro, London, 1926, p. 2. 17 Idem, p. 7. 18 Cfr Stephen Fuller, 2 Reports, London, 1789, p. 19 Whisperings of the Caribbean, New York, 1925, Ghana. 720 Cfr Barker and Sinclair, W. East African Folk Tales, London, 1917. 21 Rattray, Ashanti Proverbs, Jet 75, DS 73 Anansi Tales. Incidentally, the Ashanti have a proverb, no one tells stories to Antakuma. Captain Rattray explains the meaning, that as the spider is the fount and origin of all stories, the son, Antakuma, would be supposed to know every story in the world, having heard them from his father. The saying is used in the sense of know all about that, tell me something I do not know. Asterisk. In Jamaica they say, I'm not asking you, I'm telling you, with precisely the same meaning. In this connection it may be objected that the Jamaica Anansi's wife is called Kruki, while the present-day Ashanti speak of her as Konari or Konaro, which would seem to militate against our argument. Let us see. Frank Arcana makes the statement, the most probable tradition represents the Ashanti as deriving their origin from bands of fugitives, who in the 16th or 17th century were driven before the Muslim tribes migrating southward from the countries on the Niger and Senegal. 72 Now among the Hausa of northern Nigeria, where Major Tremarn assures us that distinction of sex is rare, the exception is made in favor of the spider perhaps to mark its superior position, and while the male spider is called Gizzo in their folklore, the female is known as Koki. 2 Might not this imply that the Jamaica Kruki is a survival of the earlier term still in use when the first slaves were dragged from the Ashanti forests? The Jamaica Anansi stories have been passed along in a living tradition by the old nanas, or Creole nurses, who correspond in many respects to the mammies of the southern states. The word nana is itself pure Ashanti and means granny. Thus Nana Barima, a maternal grandparent, Obanana, a grandchild. Today the term nana has almost disappeared from common use in Jamaica, and in its place granny is generally heard in reference to the type formerly called nanas. And as nana was generically applicable to either grandparent or grandchild, so even now granny is used in the same way, and elderly persons speak of any of their offspring beyond their immediate children by the general term him me granny. Nanas. 22 Tatum, number 183, p. 76. 23 OE Encyclopedia Britannica, 11th edition, Volume 2, article, Ashanti, 1 Pies, Beajm Tremarn, Hausa Superstitions and Customs, London, 1973. Again, the Jamaica peasant habitually makes use of words seemingly meaningless in themselves, and yet they also are pure Ashanti, and their signification has been preserved in use. To cite only an instance or two. The staple food of the Ashanti is fufu, which consists of mashed yam or plantain. Its derivation is from the word fu, meaning white. In the Jamaica bush a very superior species of white yam is known as fufu yam, and none of the peasants seem to know the origin of the term. So too, in the Jamaica mountains, there is a type of fowl with ruffled feathers and half-naked neck, as if it had been partially plucked. They are called sensi fowls, while the Ashanti word for the same kind of bird is a sense. We see the same in some of the proverbs of Jamaica. 2 Registered thus, for example, poor man never vexed, which Gardner explains by saying he is humble, and cannot afford to take offense. 7 Shows its derivation from the Ashanti Ohian Bomfa, rendered by Rattray, the poor man does not get into a rage. Registered in each case the meaning is the same, that a poor man cannot afford to take umbrage at those who are better supplied with this world's goods, and on whose charity he may be dependent. When we come to tribal customs, we find the same condition of things. And unless we are ready to accept these facts as a verification of the lasting influence which the Ashanti have exercised on the peasant population of the island, we must ascribe them to a most extraordinary series of coincidences. Thus, for example, a bush funeral is almost invariably marked by a peculiar practice. Before start underscoring for the burial ground, the coffin is raised and lowered 3 times. No one can give any real explanation for the act. Nor does local superstition seem to be attached to it. It is always done that way, and that is all there is about it. The very same practice has been in vogue among the Ashanti from prehistoric times. Fufu yams. Sensi fowls. Proverbs. Funeral customs. 25 Rattray, Ashanti Proverbs, number 697, p. 169. 26 Note: Professor Wallace states, African culture is richly endowed with proverbs. The distribution of proverbs suggests that the Negro tribes acquired them from the Semitic peoples. Wilson D. Wallace, An Introduction to Anthropology, New York, 1926, p. 324. 27 Gardner, History of Jamaica, p. 392. Captain Rattray thus explains the custom. The coffin is now closed, and a hole is knocked in the wall. Through this the coffin is carried by the assequafo. On its arrival outside it is placed on the ground, but not without a pretense being first made to set it down twice before it finally comes to rest. The reason for this curious custom is undoubtedly to give Asasia, the earth goddess, due notice and warning. Degree then, after a short ceremonial, the sextons now raise the coffin to carry it away to burial. The same courtesies are paid to the earth goddess as when the corpse was set down. 2 degrees so sacred has this custom become, that after the Ashanti had developed into a conquering nation, with the advent of the famous golden stool, the symbol of power and national vitality, on the occasion of each enthroning, or rather enstalling, of a new king, the ceremony required that he should feign 3 times to sit upon the golden stool. Actually he may not rest upon it, raising and lowering his body 3 times as it will be raised and lowered after death. Plus it is almost as if he were reminded, dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. In many other ways also, as the present writer has noted elsewhere registered. Practices connected with the Jamaica bush funerals indicate their Ashanti origin. Now, as Gardner observes, even today in Jamaica the descendants of the old slaves retain a practice that the room in which a person dies should not be swept or disturbed for 9 days. Water and other requisites are placed in it, and as among the Jews, a light is kept burning during the prescribed period. Number 4 Gardner, however, is in error, when he positively asserts that this practice is not of African origin. Hebrewism-s in Jamaica. As a matter of fact, Hebrewism-s of African derivation are not confined to Jamaica among the West Indian Islands. Blair Niles in her recent delightful little volume, Black Haiti, speaking of the slaves from Africa, positively asserts, some were said to be descendants of Jews mixed. A.R. Sutherland Rattray, Religion and Art in Ashanti, Oxford, 1927, p. 30 idem, p. 161. 31 R.S., Rattray, Ashanti, Oxford, 1923, p. 82. 82 Gen. 3, 10. 88 Whisperings of the Caribbean, Chapter 8. 34 Gardner, History of Jamaica, p. 301. Haiti. With Negroes. These were tall, well-built men whose features had a Caucasian cast and whose language was clearly Semitic in character. Dr. Price Mars, whom she quotes as an authority, also claims a distant Semitic infiltration in the antecedents of some of the San Domingo slaves. Registered ESI. This may seem to us less strange when we read Ergai. The testimony of the Reverend Henry S. Whitehead, who is speaking from information gained at first hand on the ground. While insisting that the opprobrious term worthless old Carthagene, current today in the Virgin Islands, is to be traced back to the African Carthage of the Punic Wars, he also remarks, on the doors of the Negro cabins in the country, i.e. outside the towns, crosses may be seen, much like those the Hebrews made with the blood of the Passover lamb. This is to keep out the wolf. 87 It is interesting then, to find Sir Harry Johnston's D5G view. Insisting, the Elamites of Mesopotamia appear to have been a Negroid people with kinky hair, and to have transmitted this racial type to the Jews and Seer. Ians, 88 And further noting, the Jewish hybrids with the Negro in Jamaica and Guyana reproduce most strikingly the Assyrian type. Registered. Whatever we may think of this author's claim of a Negro element in the ancient Hebrews, his attitude will make less shocking our present endeavor to show an infiltration of the same Hebrew stock in the evolving of certain distinctively Negro tribes in Africa. It is surprising too, to find a Mississippi Negro attributing to the Jews the custom so prevalent in West Africa as well as in Jamaica in the slave days, of putting food and money in the coffin with the dead so that he can eat and buy things when he gets to heaven. Degree 35 Blair Niles, Black Haiti, New York, 1926, p. 113. 36 Dr. Price Mars, Le Sentiment et le Phénomène Philippon chez les Négres de Saint-Domingue, p. de la Société d'Histoire et de Géographie de Haiti, May 10925, p. 37 Henry S. Whitehead, P.B. in the Caribbean, The Commonweal, June, E.T., 1927, p. 944, July 13, 1927, pr. 261. 88 Harry H. Johnston, The Negro in the New World, London, 1910, p. 2789 Tatum, p. 102. Azero Puckett, Folk Beliefs of the Southern Negro, p. 102. Note A. W. F. Blunt would make this a Canaanitish custom cfr Israel before Christ, London, 1924, p. 23 Grave Offering. Brian Edwards, in his brief outline of the real Iranian beliefs of the Coromantun slaves, asserts, Kampung. If they believe that a Kampung, the god of the heavens, is the creator of all things, a deity of infinite goodness. 44 In fact, we have in Jamaica today, in the parish of St. Elizabeth, a maroon town called a Kampung which according to Kundal, the island historian, was so called after an Ashanti chief who figured in one of the early rebellions of the island. One's first impression would be that this chief had arrogated to himself the title of the deity. But we are assured by J.G. Chrysler that among the Ashanti the divine name was frequently given to a slave in acknowledgement of the help of God enabling the owner to buy the slave. The supreme being among the Ashanti is Niam, whom we shall later try to identify with the Hebrew Yahweh. His primary title is Nyankopan, meaning Niam, alone. Great One registered a Kampung then, appears to be the white man's effort to express the spoken Nyankopan as heard from the early slaves. When the slave trade was at its height, two Negro nations shared the mastery of West Africa, the Ashanti and the Dahomeyans, and wherever the slaves of either tribe predominated, there we find the special forms of superstitions and witchcraft which were peculiar to that people. Thus in Cuba, San Domingo, Louisiana, etc., where the Dahomeyans were in the ascendancy, the ophiolatry of voodooism became prevalent. Registered in Jamaica, on the other Ashanti Nyankopan. Witchcraft voodooism. 41 Gardner, History of Jamaica, p. 90. 42 Kundal, Historic Jamaica, p. 325. 48 J.G. Chrysler, For Dictionary of the Asante and Fanti Language, Basel 1881, p. 343, Anyam. 44 Rattray, Ashanti, p. 86. 45 Rattray, Ashant Proverbs, No. 1, p. 10. 46 Note Ellis says, in the southeastern portions of the U Territory however, the Python deity is worshipped, and this voodoo cult, with its adoration of the snake god was carried to Dothavti by slaves from Ardra and Witta, where the faith still remains today. 724 The Dahomeys invaded Ardra and subjugated it. 3 years later Witten is conquered by the same foe. This period is beyond question that in which Khti first received the voodoo of the Africans. Thousands of Negroes from these serpent-worshipping tribes were at that time sold into slavery, and were carried across the Atlantic to the western island. They bore with them their cult the snake. At the same period, U-speaking slaves were taken to Louisiana. CFRAB Ellis, on Voodoo Worship Popular Science Monthly, Volume XX Degree 8, 1891, p. 6 STFF. Hand, voodooism is practically unknown *. While obeah with its concomitant poisonings has been rife since the earliest days *8 AES, the word obeah itself is really the Ashanti obeafo, a witch, or rather more properly, in practice as least, according to Captain Rattray, a wizard, being derived from Bai, sorcery * registered now. An Ashanti legend runs as follows. When Big Massa was busy with the work of creation, it happened that the little monkey Fo was making himself generally useful, and when the task was accomplished, he asked Big Massa, that, in return for the help rendered, all creatures should bear his name. To this Big Massa acceded to such an extent that henceforth certain classes of creatures added to their own proper names the suffix Fo, in acknowledgement of the little monkey's part in the work registered degree. Such is the Ashanti fable, and hence we find the suffix Fo in the names of peoples, nations, and occupations. During the Haitian Revolution many planters with their slaves took refuge in Cuba, whence some of them subsequently found their way to New Orleans. The voodoo cult was thus established both in Cuba and in Louisiana. 47 Note Ellis observes, that the term voodoo should survive in Haiti and Louisiana, and not in the British West India Islands, will surprise no one who is acquainted with the history of the slave trade. The Twi-speaking slaves, called Coromantes in the slave dealers' jargon, and who were exported from the European forts on the Gold Coast, were not admitted into French and Spanish colonies on account of their disposition to rebel, and consequently they found their way into the British colonies, the only market open to them. While the French and Spanish colonies drew their chief supply from the U-speaking slaves exported from Ouidah and Badagry. Sir A. Ellis, The U-speaking peoples of the slave coast of West Africa, London, 1890, p. 2048. Note: since the World War I am told, voodooism has spread in Jamaica, especially in the parish of St. Catherine. In my own experience, only once did I find any indication of voodooism, and that was in Upper Westmoreland in 1913. 49 Rattray, Ashanti Proverbs, number 56, p. 48. Note: according to M. Oldfield Howe, one of the latest writers on the subject, there are two distinct cults of fetish worship in the West Indies, voodoo or voodoo, and obia, changa and wanga. But between the voodoo and the obia cults are important differences. In the former the will of the god is communicated only through a priest and priestess, the ritual is carried out at night, and the serpent must be displayed iak. Verse the obia cult requires for its rites only a priest or a priestess, instead of the two, and the presence of the snake is not essential. Its sacrificial victims too are slain by poison instead of meeting a bloody death as in the rites of voodoo. Cir. M. Oldfield Howe, The Encircled Serpent, Philadelphia, 1928, p. 246. As we shall see later, Howe is probably in error in requiring the serpent even as a concomitant of obia, which strictly speaking is in no wise a form of ophiolatry. Hand, voodooism is practically unknown *. While obia with its concomitant poisonings has been rife since the earliest days *. 8 AES, the word obia itself is really the Ashanti obeafo, a witch, or rather more properly, in practice as least, according to Captain Rattray, a wizard, being derived from Bai, sorcery * registered now. An Ashanti legend runs as follows. When Big Massa was busy with the work of creation, it happened that the little monkey Fo was making himself generally useful, and when the task was accomplished, he During the Haitian Revolution many planters with their slaves took refuge in Cuba, whence some of them subsequently found their way to New Orleans. The voodoo cult was thus established both in Cuba and in Louisiana. 47 Note Ellis observes, that the term voodoo should survive in Haiti and Louisiana, and not in the British West India Islands, will surprise no one who is acquainted with the history of the slave trade. The Twi-speaking slaves, called Coromantes in the slave dealers' jargon, and who were exported from the European forts on the Gold Coast, were not admitted into French and Spanish colonies on account of their disposition to rebel, and consequently they found their way into the British colonies, the only market open to them. While the French and Spanish colonies drew their chief supply from the U-speaking slaves exported from Ouitar and Badagry. Sir A. Ellis, The U-speaking Peoples of the Slave Coast of West Africa, London, 1890, p. 2048. Note: since the World War, one am told, voodooism has spread in Jamaica, especially in the parish of St. Catherine. In my own experience, only once did I find any indication of voodooism, and that was in Upper Westmoreland in 1913. 49 Rattray, Ashanti Proverbs, number 56, p. 48. Note: according to M. Oldfield Howe, one of the latest writers on the subject, there are two distinct cults of fetish worship in the West Indies, voodoo or vaudou, and obia, changa and wanga. But between the voodoo and the obia cults are important differences. In the former the will of the god is communicated only through a priest and priestess, the ritual is carried out at night, and the serpent must be displayed iak verse the obia cult requires for its rites only a priest or a priestess, instead of the two, and the presence of the snake is not essential. Its sacrificial victims too are slain by poison instead of meeting a bloody death as in the rites of voodoo. Cir. M. Oldfield Howe, The Encircled Serpent, Philadelphia, 1928, p. 246. As we shall see later, Howe is probably in error in requiring the serpent even as a concomitant of obia, which strictly speaking is in no wise a form of ophiolatry. Dropping this suffix then, from obeafo, the resultant obai, as heard from the lips of the Coromantan slaves, was variously rendered by the Jamaican whites as obia, etc. For even now there is no agreement as to the correct spelling of the word. Of obia itself we shall have much to say, when we come to the consideration of Ashanti witchcraft and the source from which it was derived. For the present, let it suffice to note, that Jamaica obia is really a continuation of the Ashanti sorcery, just as Mayalism in the Jamaica bush is a residue of the old tribal religious dance of the same African race. Both with the Ashanti themselves and their descendants in Jamaica the word is commonly shortened into Obi. Thus we find the Obi country referred to in the history of the Ashanti fetish priest, Okomfo Anachi, that is, Anachi the priest. About the year 1700, after committing a capital offense, as Captain Rattray tells us, he fled for his life to the Obi country. Here he had made a study of fetish medicine and became the greatest fetish man the Ashanti have ever had. Referring to the Obi country, Rattray notes, I have so far been unable to trace this place degree *, but to this day in Ashanti any big fetish priest is called Obi Okomfo, that is, Obi priest. 5. So also in Jamaica, in the practice of obia, the native makes obi even today. In fact, what Captain Rattray witnessed among the Ashanti, e.g. his description of the making of a suman, or fetish charm, has its counterpart in the weird incantation and grotesque fabrication of the Jamaica obia man, that produces a bundle of sticks as a protection against thief or evil spirit. 51 Note how he reports, among the Witanes is a tribe called Ebos. Shepherd says this is a word of the same import as Obos, which might mean the people or worshippers of Obi, the serpent god. These people still practice a kind of serpent worship. They worship the guana, a species of lizard. The reference is to H. Shepherd, Traditions of Eden, London, 1871. Cfr. Howe, The Encircled Serpent, p. 28. Now, while not agreeing with Howie as regards the identification of Obi with the serpent god, as already noted, this citation may throw some light on the question of the Obi country. 52 Rattray, Ashanti, p. 288. Note Captain Newland states, the Megozawa, a section of the Hausa, may be found in the north of Togo and Cameroons. He notes that Megozawa signifies magician and is a term applied by the Hausa Mohammedans to those of their kin who have remained pagans. Cfr. H. Osman Newland, West Africa, London, 1922, p. 82. This may possibly be another clue to the Obi country. 53 Rattray, Ashanti, p. 310. Ashanti influence on Jamaica customs 19. Moreover, is it merely another coincidence that Duppies and JPI, Anotia? The Jamaica Duppies or ghosts are notorious